our next speaker. Apologies, we're at a little bit of a delay at this point, Haley. But so one of the points was we need non-technical solutions, and we need to kind of reach out into the real world and look at policy and look at social and political implications and solutions to some of these problems. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our next speaker, Hayley Tsukayama, who is a legislative activist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So Hayley, you can take it away.
Hello, everybody. Really, that was such a great discussion. You maybe don't even need my presentation, but let's see if I can talk a little bit about what I do. I'm here to talk to you today about. My name's Hayley Tsukayama. I'm legislative activist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. In that capacity, I work with our legislative team, which I'll talk about more, particularly at the state level, but EFF works on policy at the municipal, at the state, and at the federal level. And I'm just going to here today with a plea about why policymaking needs technologists, and talk a little bit about the work that we've done and why technologists have been so important to that work. So opening up, what is EFF? The Electronic Frontier Foundation is a nonprofit founded in 1990 that focuses on safeguarding civil liberties in the digital age. We focus on a lot of issues, but they fall into a few general buckets: free speech and free expression, privacy and innovation, kind of breaking each of those down. Free speech and free expression, a lot of the work we do is, for example, protecting journalists' ability to file records requests from governments. We look a lot at online censorship, when rules get put in place, sort of who gets amplified and who gets left out. On the privacy front, that's consumer data privacy, that's government surveillance, those kinds of things. And then innovation, another broad term, but by innovation, we're talking about a lot of copyright and IP, takedowns on YouTube, platform deplatforming, that kind of stuff, as well as things like right to repair, broadband access. Those are some of our issues. We have three main pillars within the organization that kind of make us unique. So we have a legal team, which does impact litigation. We have the activism team, which I'm a part of, which gets to talk about, I get the great job of getting to talk about our policies and trying to organize folks around some of our issues across the country. And then we have our tech projects team, which they do a lot of things, but among things that they work on, they work on for example, our Privacy Badger plugin, which people can put on their browsers to see what sites are tracking them. They do things like CertBot and HTTPS Everywhere, which are aimed at helping make the web more secure overall. So giving people those tools to do that themselves. But specifically, each of these departments is really invaluable to our legislative work, which cuts across all teams. When we're getting a piece of legislation or we're analyzing a piece of legislation, we're really trying to talk to all of the pillars of the team to talk about, sort of the legal ramifications, the political ramifications, and then also, is what this lawmaker doing even a logical thing to do, to kind of hop onto what Layla was talking about in her last talk. A little bit about me. I've been at EFF for about 3 years. Before that, I was a Washington Post reporter. I covered technology companies for about 8 years. In that capacity, I got to talk to a lot of people about tech policy. I also saw technology companies manage to block legislation or duck regulation by claiming the things that they were doing were too technical for Congress to possibly understand, that you would just come in and mess everything up if you even tried to touch them. And I really, in the course of those conversations, came to a stunning conclusion, which is that no one knows what they're doing when we're talking about tech policy. And that's a little flippant, but I really mean that, lawmakers are grappling more with the intersection between complex technology and societal issues. They often, by recognizing an issue, they're walking straight into sort of really highly technical issues, and no one really knows how to answer a lot of the questions that they're bringing up. These gaps in knowledge are understandable, but they do often show themselves in troubling and public ways, I think. We've all seen sound bites from hearings where, whether it's a comment that the internet is a series of tubes, or Mark Zuckerberg telling the Senate, like, we sell ads, Senator, that's how we make our money. These often get highlighted as that sort of highlights the lack of technical knowledge that a lot of lawmakers have, and this in turn can cause despair among people who do know what they're doing in a particular area of expertise, which I worry about. It's almost like a form of burnout, right? Where you're like, well, they don't even know what they're talking about. They're trying to legislate it, and it causes a lot of people to disengage. I don't want people to disengage. I'm going to use this little clip from Jason Chaffetz in 2012.
I'm not hearing the clip.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. It might be share with audio. If you want to reshare your screen, that might work.
Let's see. Oh, here we go. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Um, let's see.
We're going to do surgery
Got
on
it.
the internet, and we haven't had a doctor in the room tell us how we're going to change these organs. We're basically going to reconfigure the internet and how it's going to work without bringing in the nerds.
So bring in the nerds has become sort of a rallying cry for a lot of people who are working in policy, because you do often get lawmakers who want to write good bills or effective bills, or who want to hear from technical experts, and so that's a lot of reason. As I said, we're lucky to have our tech projects team at EFF. That's a lot of reason why people come and chat with us, because we have that quiver in that arrow in our quiver as well. Just a few questions we've gotten from legislators in the 3 years that I've been at EFF. I was smiling catching the end of the last talk, because of course, when people are trying to legislate around automated decision-making systems, or what is the proper role of government in regulating those systems, you get questions like, what is fairness? And like, can you even come up with a universal definition of fairness? So anyway, these are just some of the questions that we've gotten from legislators, that we have had to throw to our tech team, that have been really important to our policy discussions. There is a trap when it comes to when it comes to lawmakers wanting to talk to technologists, which I do call the nerd harder problem. Of throwing up Arthur C. Clarke's third law there, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Often lawmakers will look at technical solutions and they'll say, okay, if we just throw this to an algorithm, or if we just throw this to a computer program, they'll be less biased, for example, than a person, right? Or they'll say, that will just fix it. If we just collect all the data, then we'll know everything that there is to know. That is the trap of nerding harder. They just think that if you throw more technology at problems, that you can fix everything. And so when we meet with lawmakers, with our technical experts, there are a few kind of pointers that we try to hit on. So one is to define the problems and potential solutions clearly, right? To make sure that we're having a discussion about, first of all, like, what is the problem they're trying to solve? So for example, in that last slide I had, for example, like, what is, we had a lawmaker come in and they say, well, I want to regulate smart speakers. And so the first question has to be, okay, when you say smart speaker, what do you mean? Because there are some clear products that you would be thinking about, right? I think people, Alexa, Google Home, Apple HomePod, but then there are other smart devices that maybe they're trying to capture that aren't speakers. There are other speakers that maybe aren't doing the same thing that those, in terms of data collection, that those products are doing. So you have to really define those. Keep expectations low, yours and theirs. I think, it can be frustrating when we do bring in technical experts, sort of how, and we're saying, okay, look, a lawmaker wants to make a law about this particular issue that you work on, how little research lawmakers have, how little time they have to do research. So you are often explaining things that are pretty basic. And then also kind of getting back to the magical thinking that tech can solve everything, being clear with the lawmaker that, a technical solution is not always the answer here. And then also important really to listen to other people. sorry, a lot of these issues, as you know, if you're talking about, technology used for policing, or you're talking about algorithms used to decide fair housing, or when we were talking even about COVID and the use of vaccine passports and stuff like that, there is a technical aspect to it, and then there's a societal aspect to it. And so a lot of what we do at EFF is try to think through, use technologists as part of a larger grassroots coalition or a larger group of organizations who are coming to work on a problem, so that we can ground the solutions that we're suggesting in technology, in real technology that can do what it promises, but also that we are thinking about, not just the technical issues, but about sort of all the ways that all the dynamics between communities that these issues bring up. I have a couple case studies, so where technologists were really helpful. So the Stop Online Privacy Act and Protect IP Act, SOPA PIPA. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary of our victory over SOPA PIPA. These were a series of bills promoted by Hollywood in the US Congress that would have created a blacklist of censored websites. There was a real technical gap here, or actually a couple. The laws were so broad that they would have swept in far more speech than intended, particularly in 2012. We were kind of at the beginning of the idea of what user-generated content looked like. We had a lot of concerns about, well, I was actually still a reporter at this time, but I wasn't at EFF, but there were a lot of concerns about, sort of whose speech would make it through some of the blacklist and whose speech wouldn't. Suggestions were also made to alter the domain name system, or DNS, which would have made it really difficult for websites to operate globally. I think, again, thinking back on my time as a reporter and covering this story, what really tipped the balance on this policy debate, I think, really was the fact that we had a lot of prominent technologists, a lot of prominent computer scientists, internet architecture engineers saying that, these laws would have really been problematic and essentially broken the internet. And the result of our activism was the great internet blackout of 2012. So I don't know if folks remember or were cognizant of of this, but this was a movement. We actually, in this case, got a lot of the big tech companies to agree with us standing against SOPA PIPA. So that picture I have there is Google with the logo of their, the search engine blacked out. Wikipedia did similar things, Reddit. We had a lot of popular blogs at the time. They all did this blackout kind of protest to show that, this legislation would have the effect of, sort of blocking out a lot of their content. And we were able to defeat those laws. A little more recently and a little more close to home. So as I said, I work on state legislation. A lot of that is in California, where EFF is based. We were recently looking at questions about broadband infrastructure and broadband access. This is a huge issue, obviously, especially in the pandemic. And so the question was, how should California invest in broadband infrastructure to meet the needs of the next 50 years? The technical gap here is that, we basically the companies that were lobbying the most heavily on this were the incumbent companies that have a lot of control in the state of California in terms of, who they're servicing and who gets internet. They have a lot of control actually over who gets fast internet in the state of California because it relies entirely on their kind of build out plans. So, they were insisting they didn't want to cede any ground to smaller companies or municipal broadband. So they were really insisting that we didn't need much more investment, that low speeds that they were offering were sufficient to meet the needs required for remote work, for remote school, for telehealth, for increasing web usage. To get at that technical gap, we actually asked both our in-house technologist, Bennett Cyphers, as well as we worked with some other outside folks to write a couple of white papers for us about the, comparing and contrasting the differences between different internet architecture. So fiber to the home, DSL that we have currently, satellite internet, right? And just kind of talking about the limitations of each, the pros and cons of each. We use those white papers extensively when talking to legislators' offices, just to, again, sort of lay down a baseline of what we knew to be true, as well as to combat sort of the big players' arguments that, it was too technical, don't even worry about it, like, we got this, just let us continue the way that we're going. As a result of those efforts, we passed a budget and laws that allocated combined $6 billion in broadband funding in the state, which includes funding to build a middle mile broadband network in California, which, as I understand it, is basically like we're building the highways for the internet, and we're also making funding available for underserved communities to receive favorable financing to kind of build out to their own communities, so that they can really come up with the best solutions for internet for in their own communities to answer their own needs. So in this case, again, we partnered with a large group of people. We had AARP, we had California Medical Association, we had a lot of folks, but of course we also had the technologists who were really there and so invaluable to helping us figure out like what was actually feasible in terms of what networks to build and what technology to recommend, and how to think about it. So that is a California example. In terms of like another area, just a last case study here on places where I personally have had such help from technologists is in the area of dark patterns. So dark patterns is I often think of it as like coercive design. So dark patterns is a term that we use in the privacy world to talk about, for example, when you download a new app and the app says, do you want to share your contact information with us? And then the yes button is like in a huge, colorful, friendly button, and the no is like way down at the bottom and you almost can't see it. It blends into the background. That's an example of a dark pattern where somebody is trying to steer you towards making a selection that benefits them, but may or may not benefit you. But one problem with tech policy in general is that you often don't want to put in mandates that are going to age poorly, right? And you also don't want to be too prescriptive. So, you could address the problem of dark patterns by saying everybody has to have 2 buttons and they have to be this many pixels by this many pixels and they have to be this font. And that's the kind of thing we actually don't want to put in legislation, because that was likely to age badly. But we do want to think about, are there guidelines that we can talk about, or regulations that we can talk about in dark patterns that will age well, and that are both specific enough and broad enough to stand the test of time. Technical gap here, lawmakers are not well versed in how companies verify the identities of people, or how they sign people on, or how they collect data, or how psychology plays into the way that they create these workflows, or even really about graphic design. So in this case, we've brought again together a lot of people. Particularly, we've been talking to workers who actually build these user flows for companies, and have a lot of that technical knowledge of how all that works, so that we can talk more about sort of how to address this issue. This is a pending result. In California right now, there is a working definition of a dark pattern in the California Privacy CPRA. Well, anyway, in the newest version of the California Consumer Privacy Act. Sorry, I work with a lot of acronyms. A lot of them have C's and P's, and I never quite remember from acronym to acronym which thing I'm trying to say. So as you can see there is a working definition. This is the California definition, but it does say at the end, or is further defined by regulation. And so we are still kind of talking through these questions with lawmakers. So I've just talked a lot, but if you are interested and you're not engaged at the moment, there are a lot of ways you can get started and use your technical expertise to talk to lawmakers. Literally, the first thing I would recommend is to write or call a lawmaker's office. If you see a bill that is under discussion, or if you have concerns, talk to your lawmaker. Another open secret is that you are wildly more qualified than you could possibly imagine to write to a lawmaker's office. They really want to hear from constituents. They really need technical expertise. And so if you see a problem in a bill that you think, this is exactly what I talk about every day, and I really think that they should be considering X, Y, or Z, do it. Right. Don't walk, run. That's kind of a low-level individual thing you can do. You can also join advocacy groups. I mean, obviously, I would love if you joined EFF. We also have a number of loosely federated grassroots groups across the country. Specifically for your audience, I pulled out our Rhode Island rights folks who deal with a lot of the same issues that we're looking at. But there are a lot of really interesting groups right now. We're seeing a huge rise in, and I'm delighted to see it, of technologists who want to use their powers for social good. So that's just a couple of folks that that I have heard of. I'm sure there are many more that I'm not aware of. And then also look for jobs in the policy world. We're increasingly seeing regulators, attorneys general, consumer protection agencies, lawmakers put in sort of tech fellowship positions, or even to hire staff technologists, because I think they realize, especially with the rise of interest in, for example, privacy, that they're really on the back foot and they need that help. So if you are at all interested, there's a lot of opportunities out there. Okay, I am, if you cannot tell, a very nervous speaker, so I'm relieved to see my last slide, but I'm happy to take questions and comments, or really just chat with anybody. Really want to hear what you have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hayley. Thank you. That was, yes, I love this idea of building a grassroots coalition of technologists to get out and start doing some of this work. So thank you for that inspiration. I would love to open the floor now to questions. I can see either your raised hand in the chat, or you can unmute, I think. Any questions?
One of my questions is for EFF, kind of okay, so there was something interesting that I noticed, which is in a way, EFF is a lobbying organization, which is really cool. But I think that also you obviously don't have as much money as technology companies, because they have collectively trillions, if not more, money. And so I'm wondering what are the challenges there of being, even though EFF is very well established, very reputable, and has a very long history, and obviously also has more resources than for instance, if I just went out and I was lobbying and in the capital of Massachusetts, just raving against the senators. I'm wondering what have been the challenges, but also the upsides of being an EFF in terms of kind of maybe addressing legislation that is not beneficial to tech corporations. But
yeah, no, so great question. I mean, you're definitely right that there is an imbalance. I mean, as I said, I work on state legislation, and we've seen, for example, yeah, I can say it. We've seen Microsoft go to a lot of states with a privacy bill that really is not very people friendly, right? It definitely protects sort of the way that they operate, and then kind of puts a veneer of privacy over it. And that is really frustrating. In terms of, things that we've been able to do, I do think that, honestly, not just because of this presentation and this audience, but I do think being able to have that kind of technical expertise to cut against that perception that companies are happy to put forward, that, if you it's too complex, if you touch us, you'll ruin the American economy, right? Just trust us about that. These are our data practices. Being able to have someone go in, just as a third party, and say, okay, but actually looking at the way that this seems to flow, or looking at your policy here, that doesn't seem to be the case. So really, just even putting up a counterbalance to that narrative is helpful. I think also being able to share information between, I talked about our kind of loose federation of groups, being able to have our talking points out there, so we just have people in a lot of different places. So even though we can't afford necessarily to staff up, like, you know, TechNet, for example, has a regional version of me, you know, for like 6 regions, and then they have people that report to them. It's just me, EFF. So, but, you know, to kind of have these other organizations and be able to get our talking points out. We're working a lot on toolkits and stuff like that, that I'm hoping we'll be able to roll out to kind of more effectively fight some of those battles. So, and honestly, it's amazing. You know, I can get pretty cynical, especially after 8 years of tech journalism and doing this activism work. But a thing that is always true is that legislators are interested in hearing from their constituents. And so if you can get a constituent to talk to some, like a sponsor of a bill or somebody, that goes a long way. And that is a power that is not, you know, that isn't necessarily in the playbook of those big companies, right? And so if you can find kind of, you know, it really comes down to like engaging with the community and the people who are most affected by the problems that we're talking about, and then helping them kind of, you know, giving them assistance in terms of, you know, being able to tell their story and being able to make their pitch. So those are just some things off the top of my head.
Thank you. And I'm really glad I stayed and watched this talk.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from either our in-person or virtual participants? I can field from anyone. Okay. I'm kind of interested to hear, I guess, in the same vein of what we were talking about before. It was interesting that you mentioned the difficulty of fast-paced technology, and how by the time you're putting something into a bill or advocating a policy change that has to do with a particular technology, maybe it moved on. So when you're talking about this toolkit that you're putting together, or like initiatives that help either educate people or like lobby for policy changes, how do you advise technologists, like if for people who might be looking to like design or build some of those technologies to be useful for the people you're working with, or to help kind of advocate a better way to do things as technologists, like how would you advise to like handle that problem of the fast pace? Do we really just try to like slow it down, or do we try to mediate somehow?
Another great question. I mean, it's hard, and of course, as with everything, it kind of depends on what you're talking about. But generally speaking, the way that we've tried to get around, you know, to get at the question of like, how do you make tech policy when the technology is changing all the time, is that we do try to kind of set down principles, right? So, I mean, I think that it can be why sometimes tech policy in particular can feel really vague, because you're kind of talking about like a rights centered approach, or you know, like a compliance centered approach of like, okay, maybe we don't know what the technology is going to be, but you should audit it every year, or, you know, that kind of thing. And so it is a really tricky situation. And I think, you know, especially, I don't know, it's really interesting because I think like bill introduction and like bill ideas, that happens really fast. Like that's like on a fast cycle. And then actually like passing laws happens on a pretty slow cycle, and then seeing the effect of laws you pass is on an even slower cycle, and that's all out of sync with technology and the way that it's developing. So that is, you know, a lot of the times we are trying to like identify harms, right? So if you're talking about like AI regulation, it is hard, and you know, you in some ways you don't want to get ahead of yourself, right? But it is, you know, we are kind of looking at harms and like, okay, what is the harm that we see? How would we mitigate that harm regardless of like what technology people are using? It doesn't always work. Like a question I get asked a lot in terms of machine learning versus privacy, to kind of piggyback off Layla's talk, is like, how much data do you need? And like, if you talk to some people, they're like, well, we want as much data as we can get, but we also realize that that's not necessarily the right thing to do, or the, you know, the ethical thing to do. So we hang out a lot in those kind of gray spots, but a lot of times, sorry, just to get back to your question, yeah, we do think more about sort of frameworks or rights-centered or harm-centered approaches, and how we can deal with those in a sort of technology agnostic way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I love how these talks are blending together like that human-centered approach, you know, just like refocusing on dealing with the needs of people and like less on the needs of the technology. So that's really cool. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other lingering questions? I know we're running a little behind schedule here. Sorry, so we're gonna break for lunch for anyone who's in the Brown area. You can join us at 164 Angel for pizza. And I want to encourage everyone to come back at 1 p.m. We're gonna hear Isabella Valletta Small talk about border security and surveillance, specifically at the border and policy. And so I'm really interested to hear her talk after lunch at 1 p.m. So until then, everyone, same Zoom link. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Thanks again.